of the budget. Once he's complete, he will take questions, and he will be moderating the discussion. Please limit it to one question and one follow-up. That allows everybody an opportunity to try to get a question in. So without further ado, General Horlander.
So good afternoon. Great to be back here again and see some familiar faces here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to present to you the overview of the Army's 2018 budget request. More importantly, I will tell you I am even more so pleased to be able to continue to serve our great country in uniform as an Army soldier. So that's always something that inspires me. I'll take a few minutes here and in the process of providing an overview of what the Army is doing today, I'll sketch out the current operating environment, what our fiscal posture has looked like over the last 5 to 6 years, and how this request supports the administration's and the Army leadership's priorities. And then, of course, I'll spend some time providing a by-appropriation review of some of the details of the Army's request. America's Army is increasingly more and more active in worldwide operations across the globe. I would offer to you that the current pictorial on the slide before you not only represents some of the current operations where Army forces are heavily engaged, but it should remind us all of the velocity of instability across the world and how this same pictorial will continue to change in the years to come. This observation alone makes it increasingly clear that the ability to simultaneously conduct decisive action, major combat operations while maintaining our counterinsurgency competencies for the current fight represent the most demanding challenge that the Army faces. Properly resourced and trained, a ready Army can perform successfully across this full spectrum of operations, but it must also continue to advance its capacity and capabilities for tomorrow's conflicts. Today, ground forces remain the most globally committed U.S. military force, with more than 180,000 U.S. Army soldiers from the active component, the National Guard, and the Reserve committed to combatant command missions in over 140 countries worldwide. America's soldiers directly contribute to our nation's efforts to defeat ISIS, support governance in Afghanistan, and deter conflict throughout Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. This steady demand for trained and ready Army units provides our nation with the ability to defeat adversaries, assure our allies, and deter potential aggressors. While this chart depicts current operations where America's Army is engaged, the next fight could represent an existential strategic challenge posed by peer powers, some with nuclear capabilities, advanced technologies, and large and more sophisticated militaries. While it is difficult to define with precision the character of future warfare, its broad outlines can be anticipated. We should plan on all domains of warfare being contested, a technologically sophisticated and numerically superior enemy that initially possesses positional advantage. These anticipated attributes of future warfare demand a continued investment not only in current competencies, but the Army's future capacity and capabilities in order to protect America's national security interests both today and tomorrow. Conducting current operations, sustaining current readiness, and making progress towards a more modern, capable, and lethal future Army will require predictable and consistent funding year to year. The Army's FY2018 request takes important steps to improve readiness and close some vulnerability gaps while supporting the groundwork for a future force ready to face the changing threats of tomorrow. It's valuable to start by looking at the Army's budget over time and providing a little commentary that may inform your views of the Army's current funding request. As you can see clearly from the chart, the Army's base budget has been on the decline since 2012, while inflation during the same time period has averaged between 1% and 2.5%. The recently enacted FY2017 Defense Appropriation Act and the FY2018 request represents an upturn in the Army's suppressed top-line funding since the implementation of the Budget Control Act, and starts to arrest the Army's readiness decline and sets the conditions for improving the current and future readiness of the force. The base budget, represented on this chart, and as you know is meant to man, train, and equip the nation's Army, has been significantly impacted by the Budget Control Act, as this optic depicts. Fortunately, the Army's been able to maintain some current warfighting readiness with the flexibility provided through 2 bipartisan budget agreements and the OCO funding provided by our government. The marked decrease in our base funding level over the past few years had forced the Army to mortgage long-term investments for the benefit of near-term readiness. Likewise, in OCO, not fully represented on this chart, as large contingency operations have become smaller, the Army's OCO budget has been reduced consistent with the requirements of the contingency operations we are supporting. As is clearly portrayed on this chart, the funding levels of the recently enacted 17 budget and this 18 base request are consistent with the administration's goals for the U.S. Army to rebuild readiness, reverse in-strength reductions, and prepare for future challenges. With this FY18 President's Budget submission, the following are some of the main highlights of our request. First and foremost, the budget has been formulated to provide the combatant commands with the best trained and ready land forces that we can generate. To do that, we must fully fund the counterterrorism and counterinsurgency competencies necessary for the current fight, while also building decisive action capabilities for potential major combat operations consistent with the threats that some near-peer nation states may pose. That requires the Army to increase its global responsiveness capabilities and support regional engagements and partnership activities with our allies. The budget request further sustains a force of 1,018,000 soldiers across the total Army with realistic and specialized training and the best maintained equipment we can provide. We were able to focus some of our resources on the Army's installations and infrastructure needs to better support the operations and training of the force. With this budget, we are able to sustain the Army's modernization programs and invest in programs to advance soldier and technological overmatch capabilities. We do all this while seeking to achieve the highest levels of accountability and stewardship to maximize the purchasing power of the Army's budget. This budget and those that follow should provide the Army the necessary resources to conduct current operations, improve current readiness, and make progress towards a more modern, capable, and lethal future Army, provided predictable and consistent funding is available in a timely manner and at a funding level commensurate with current and future demands on the force. The topical discussion that follows highlights both the priorities we use to formulate the budget and the components of this 2018 budget request to achieve senior leader priorities and objectives to achieve the U.S. Army's ultimate goal of remaining the best led, equipped, and most ready ground force in the world. The Army's base budget request is $137.2 billion, an increase of almost $7 billion over the FY17 enacted amount for the base. As you should observe, with that margin of growth, there are notable increases in military pay, O&M, or operations and maintenance, and infrastructure to support the larger end strength. This slide represents funding requirements for all 3 components of the Army: the regular Army, the National Guard, and the Army Reserve, and is a breakout in the aggregate across the major defense appropriations. We will talk about each appropriation in more detail on subsequent slides. However, I take this opportunity to point out at the aggregate level where much of the growth is represented. The 2017 National Defense Authorization Act reversed the previously planned in-strength decline and authorized a total Army in-strength of 1,018,000 soldiers. A much appreciated start to ensuring the Army has fully manned formations. The increase in this FY18 request goes to covering the readiness requirements of that growth, both military pay and funding for training the force. Additionally, the Army was able to leverage the growth to address recurring readiness shortfalls, primarily in our O&M funded operations in the areas of training and infrastructure. Only a small portion of the growth remained to apply to our future modernization accounts. I will walk you through the details in subsequent discussions. So I'll start with our MilPERS account. This slide provides you a clear picture of Army in-strength levels and how they remain stable from 17 as a land force requirement could presumably continue to increase, the demands on a land force requirement. Many of you are aware that the U.S. Army in-strength has declined markedly in recent years across all 3 components. The Army accordingly had to reduce its force structure to avoid building a hollow Army. With the recently authorized increase to the 1,018,000 level, the Army has been able to increase personnel readiness, fill some holes in its formations, and source some of the necessary force structure changes. The FY18 budget request maintains this increased end strength. The Army will achieve this increase through enlisted and officer accessions and retention. Funding associated with these necessary retention efforts is represented on the following slide. Military personnel appropriation accounts for the largest portion of the Army's base budget. Our request funds a multi-component Army of just over 1 million soldiers and covers pay, allowances, recruiting and retention incentives, permanent change of station moves, and man days for some training in the reserve components. Given our initial in-strength ramp in FY17 and subsequent reversal and full sustainment in 18 of the 1,018,000 force level, you can see that our request is a full $2.8 billion higher than the FY17 enacted amount. Both the Army's increased end strength and the rate increases in our soldiers' basic pay, housing allowance, and subsistence account for this growth. I will now transition to the Army's operations and maintenance appropriations. As I mentioned earlier, this is one area where we are requesting growth from the current year's budget. Starting with the regular Army, the 2018 budget request totals $38.9 billion and seeks to resource a more balanced readiness across the force. This readiness is more than being prepared for current-day contingency operations, but includes readiness for decisive action missions with the capability to conduct major combat operations. This fuller spectrum of readiness is reflected in the Army's 19 combat training center rotations for which we are seeking funding. These rotations are focused on decisive action training for both regular Army and reserve components. The Army's request also provides for critical funding for regional engagement activities with our allies and strategic partners for training missions such as Pacific Pathways, of which some of you are familiar with. This request will cover the sustainment of the Army's equipment and represents a small increase in depot maintenance to help bring our equipment to a greater level of repair and by enhancing Army prepositioned stocks that will improve global responsive capabilities. This request strongly supports base operations support requirements on the Army's 74 major installations, funding it at 98% of the critical requirement. Fortunately, we were also able to increase facility sustainment funding from 67% of the critical requirement of last year to 75% for this year. These funding levels are consistent across all three Army components, and while they represent an improvement over recent years, we still assume risk across our installations, as a large amount of backlog maintenance still exists across the force. The Army's 2018 budget request supports a $10.2 billion O&M requirement for the Army National Guard and the U.S. Army Reserve. For the Army National Guard, its 2018 O&M request is also nominally higher than its 2017 funding level. Consistent with the regular Army, it seeks to restore readiness and base operations support, as well as provide funding to continue supporting family and soldier programs that promote the well-being of the Army's most valuable asset, our people. For the U.S. Army Reserve, their $2.9 billion O&M budget request supports 77 functional brigades, its 3 installations, over 840 reserve centers, and the professional education and specialized skills training for its 199,000 soldiers. Having spent a few minutes discussing Army near-term readiness and manning the force, let's now transition to Army modernization. The Army's FY18 Research, Development, and Acquisition budget request of $26.8 billion represents an increase of $600 million from the FY17 enacted level. That's an enacted level that includes a pretty sizable uptick because of the amendment that was recently included in the FY17 Appropriation Act. However, I would say that the majority of this increase is more so in research, development, testing and evaluation than it is in the procurement accounts, as you'll see. This budget request represents the modernization priorities that we must pursue in order to advance material solutions that enable the Army to retain our advantage against advanced adversaries and to address a broader range of potential threats. This request prioritizes the requirements necessary to deter and, if required, defeat near-peer adversaries. The Army is accepting risk in developing of new capabilities in order to prioritize incremental upgrades of our ground and air systems so that we can put in the hands of our soldiers in the near term a greater and more lethal capability. In the upper right-hand quadrant of the chart, you will see a list of the Army's top 10 modernization priorities. And I'm going to break script here. This is a really important list here that as I go through the remainder of this briefing, you're going to see me kind of go in order here based upon these top 10 priorities. But these are really important as you try to understand how we made some choices across our modernization portfolios. These were developed as a result of the strategic portfolio analysis review process to prioritize limited modernization funding in order to balance near-term readiness requirements against long-term force development. We call this the SPAR. The SPAR process allows Army leaders to review and address our most critical capability gaps in order to make informed decisions within the existing resources. In the next two charts, I will highlight how our budget request supports these priorities. The lower right pie chart shows the Army's 11 largest equipment portfolios. What I'd ask you to take away from this is that the Army requires a broad, comprehensive set of modernization efforts in order to successfully execute the diverse missions the combatant commanders require. So let me transition to the procurement portion of our research, development, and acquisition, or our modernization portfolios. Our FY2018 request of $17.4 billion is consistent with what we saw in 18, if not just slightly below that, or 17, excuse me. As mentioned in the previous slide, in this budget request, the Army has focused its modernization efforts within the 10 priority areas. These priorities will ensure we allocate resources to sustain and upgrade the most important weapon systems, munitions, and other critical equipment our units required for a near-peer fight. I will now provide highlights for these 10 priorities. Starting with air and missile defense, the air and missile defense and the long-range fires represent the Army's most urgent and pressing capability needs. Given the possibility of confronting a force with substantial anti-access and area denial capabilities, the Army needs to advance its short-range air defense and long-range fires capabilities. This budget request includes funding for several critical air and missile defense systems, to include the procurement and installation of 131 Patriot modification kits and the investment in the Avenger surface-to-air missile system supports and interim modernization plan. In the area of long-range fires, to improve our ability to respond effectively to surface fires for cannon and rocket artillery and missiles, this budget request includes funding for 3 of the Army's most critical fire systems. The service life extension of 121 expired ATACMS missiles, adding another 10 years of service life to them. The procurement of 6,000 guided multiple launch rocket systems, and the continued low-rate initial production of 93 Patriot missile segment enhancements. The budget accounts for both the Army's operational and training munitions requirements. Consistent with the efforts to increase our inventory of munitions in 2017, the 2018 request will help ensure the availability of critical munitions for the combatant commands. 3 areas to highlight include the increased production of over 88,000 unguided Hydra 70 rockets, 480 rounds of War Reserve inventory replenishment for the Excalibur, and the modernization of ammunition industrial facilities to improve munition production, place depleted stocks, and create capacity for increased future demand. For example, the Army is pursuing a multi-year effort to improve the Holston Army ammunition plant in Tennessee, which will benefit all of the armed services. In the area of mobility, lethality, and protection of our maneuver formations, the Army has developed a combat vehicle modernization strategy for the Abrams, Stryker, Bradley, Armored Multi-Purpose Vehicle, or the AMPV, and the howitzer fleets. This includes upgrades to both the Bradley and Abrams platforms and procurement of 42 low-rate initial production AMPVs. Additionally, for the Paladin Integrated Management System, the request procures full-rate production of 59 sets comprised of the self-propelled howitzer and the tracked ammunition carrier. The request procures commercially available active protection systems for the Abrams tank for installation on vehicles within our Armored Brigade Combat Team in Europe. On today's battlefield, the Army requires a greater ability to conduct electronic warfare against its near-peer adversaries and requires an electronic warfare capability at the brigade level and below. The Army's needs for EW are primarily funded with RDT&E dollars. However, this request does include some other procurement funding to support the integration of the Prophet system on Stryker and MRAP vehicles. The Army is committed to eliminating network infrastructure capability gaps within the next 24 months and will procure new systems when possible to support network modernization. These include the Joint Battle Command Platform and the Warfighter Information Network Tactical, which will enable more secure communications from company to corps level. The budget request sustains the Army's aviation portfolio capacity and capability to address near-term threats and improve overall aircraft survivability by procuring AH-64s, 60s, and 47 aircraft. For the AH-64 Echo Apache, this request procures 13 new builds, and it also provides advanced procurement and full-rate production of 48 reman aircraft. The UH-60 M-model Black Hawks funding will procure 48 reman aircraft. And the request for the CH-47 Chinook funding will procure 4 G-model and 2 F-model new builds. So now let me transition to RDT&E, or Research, Development, Testing, and Evaluation appropriation. For the Army, it is requesting a $9.4 billion request. And as you can see, that's about $1 billion above what was enacted in FY2017. This enables the Army to prioritize the incremental upgrade of existing systems over new starts so that we can put technologically advanced equipment and more lethal weaponry in the hands of soldiers sooner. The FY2018 request includes $2.4 billion for science and technology funding, for weapons and munitions advanced technology, which will demonstrate a mobile high-energy laser system to defeat multiple threats at the tactical range. It will fund advances in combat vehicles and automotive technology, which will inform the next generation of combat platforms. And it funds aviation advanced technology efforts, which will provide transformational capabilities and component technologies for future vertical lift. Turning towards engineering, manufacturing, development efforts, here are some important focus areas within the top 10 priorities that we've described. In the area of integrated air and missile defense, again, our number one priority for air and missile defense for the tactical forces in a contested environment. Within the RDT&E portfolio, we are investing in the Stinger Product Improvement Program, the Patriot Product Improvement Program to continue software improvements, and the ongoing risk reduction tests, limited user tests, and upgrades to existing assets to support developmental testing at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. To advance the Army's long-range fires capability, we are investing RDT&E funds to increase the range, volume of fire, and the precisions and guidance of our cannon and missile systems, and to further enable precision fires in a GPS-denied environment. This includes a next-generation, common, low-drag, guided, hypervelocity cannon artillery projectile capable of multiple missions across different artillery systems. It includes an ATACMS product improvement program that focuses on safety, cost reductions, reliability, deficiency corrections, standardization, and a new improved operational capability. To improve mobility, lethality, and protection of vehicles and weapon systems, we are pursuing cost-effective replacements of obsolete vehicles and improvements of proven platforms. These leading efforts in this area are prototyping and system-level testing of the AMPV, a third-generation forward-looking infrared and ammunition data link for advanced multiple-purpose rounds for both the Abrams tank and the Bradley fighting vehicle. Our commercial and military global positioning systems are susceptible to jamming and spoofing. The Army requires both standalone and embedded capabilities to ground and air platforms, communications, weapon systems, and munitions to combat this threat. And the assured positioning, navigation, and timing can provide these capabilities. In the area of electronic warfare, I covered previously when I spoke about the procurement portion of our portfolio, but in the area of electronic warfare and in response to the U.S. Army Europe's operational needs, we will provide planning capabilities to coordinate, manage, and deconflict the use of electromagnetic spectrum and synchronized spectrum operations. The newly established Rapid Capabilities Office is working with program managers and other stakeholders to rapidly deliver an integrated electronic warfare capability to the tactical force and accelerate the development of assured P&T capabilities as well to enable ground maneuver in a GPS-denied environment. Defensive cyber operations enables global, regional, and local cyberspace defenders to conduct mission planning and protection measures. In the area of cyber, our RDT&E efforts are centered on the Persistence Cyber Training Environment program that supports cyber training ranges for both initial and unit-level training, proficiency, and certification. In this final RDT&E priority category of vertical lift, we are continuing to improve the turbine engine program, the Chinook product improvement program, and the Apache product improvement program that continues the development of the H-64 Echo capability version 6 configuration. This chart lists programs valued at greater than $200 million that represent the Army's major investments in the top 10 modernization priorities with requested procurement quantities for each. So I'll leave that for your study, but I just wanted to give you an appreciation for some of the procurement quantities here. So let me transition to our facilities. One of the keys to readiness is installation readiness and investing in the Army's infrastructure. I discussed previously during the O&M portion of this briefing the Army's investment in the restoration and modernization of its existing facilities. The Army's MILCON, or new construction, continues to be funded at a comparatively low level, although markedly more than last year. As you can see, there is growth in the FY2018 level compared to FY2016 and 17, but it is still one of the smallest MILCON's budgets in recent years, as the Army will fund 37 construction projects totaling $1.2 billion with this request. In the Army Family Housing Account, which totals $529 million, there is some growth primarily to support an additional 6 projects totaling $183 million at various locations. And lastly, the Army's FY2018 BRAC funding supports environmental cleanup, restoration, and conveyance of excess properties at previously BRAC locations. Within the Army's budget request are several requirements that are managed and funded separately outside the main appropriations. This year's request includes almost $71 million for the Arlington National Cemetery. This goes to funding its day-to-day operations, and there are 29 restoration and modernization projects for the Arlington National Cemetery. The Army is also requesting $962 million for the congressionally mandated chemical demilitarization program. FY2018 funds support continued plant operations in both Pueblo, Colorado, and Bluegrass, Kentucky. As many of you are aware, the Army's been managing large overseas contingency operation budgets since 2001. This has been an account that has ebbed and flowed as contingency operations have expanded and contracted over time. The Army's 2018 OCO budget request represents requirements in military personnel, operations and maintenance, and research, development, and acquisition. This year's multi-component request totals $28.9 billion. The 2018 OCO request supports Operations Freedom Sentinel and the CENTCOM AOR, Operation Spartan Shield, Operation Inherent Resolve in Iraq, the European Reassurance Initiative in Europe. The request also includes $4.9 billion for the Afghan Security Force Fund, and $1.8 billion for the counter-ISIL train and equip requirements. This is a fund that now replaces both the Iraq and the Syria train and equip fund. The $2.9 billion MILPERS portion of this OCO request primarily supports mobilized reserve component soldiers and maintains the current in-strength levels in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I know there was some discussion in the previous with Mr. Roth and General Iardi up here. Right now, this request just covers what is currently authorized and we have there in theater. The operations and maintenance portion represents almost 2/3 of the Army's OCO request and supports theater operations and support, transportation, force protection, support contracts, mobilization requirements, and resetting of equipment returning from theater. And a smaller portion of the request in our procurement accounts is for replacement of battle losses, ammunition consumption, and prepositioned stocks in Europe, so in support of ERI. So I'd like to take a moment because ERI has become such a pretty sizable portion of the OCO request, so I provide you a pictorial there. But this 18 request represents about $3.2 billion to continue investing in the European Reassurance Initiative, of course demonstrating the United States' resolve and commitment to the territorial integrity of the 28 NATO member nations. The request increases Army's presence in Europe by rotating a full Armor Brigade combat team, a Combat Aviation Brigade minus, a Divisional Mission Command element, and its key supporting enablers. Additionally, the Army is enhancing European posture by continuing preposition equipping efforts that were started in FY2017 to eventually achieve an end state of 2 full ABCTs at division headquarters and key enabler equipment sets. These prepositioned equipment sets increase the Army's strategic mobility and reduce U.S. response time in the event of a contingency operation. The Army is also resourcing additional European training exercises aimed at demonstrating U.S. capabilities to deploy combat power to Europe on short notice and seamless integration operational capabilities with our NATO partners. As you can see from this request, the budget addresses a vast complexity of requirements needed to restore and rebuild America's Army for today and tomorrow's missions. It represents a balance between the size of the force, the current readiness requirements, and the necessary investment in modernization to ensure our Army remains the premier ground force of the future, capable of protecting the national security interests of our country. Ladies and gentlemen, your Army's FY2018 request seeks to satisfy the objectives and the themes laid out previously in this briefing and restated on this final slide. I thank you for your attention, and I welcome your questions at this time. Yes, sir. Oh, we got them. Okay. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned you're moving kind of towards updating legacy platforms and away from new starts. Is that the ground mobility vehicle and mobile protected firepower vehicles? Last year were new starts that were supposed, I guess, priorities for infantry brigades. Are those gone now? Has that been terminated?
No. They're not gone. They're just not a new start anymore for this year. So there is some funding for those.
So it sounds like you're focusing a bit on, at least the things you mentioned, updating armor brigades as opposed to anything else. Is that fair?
It's consistent with not just maintaining the counterterrorism and the counterinsurgency competencies that we have, but we really need to have a more robust capability for a major force-on-force combat operation with near-peer competitors and those that have some pretty sizable armor formations. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, General. The aviation programs, I mean, there's a little bit of a cut in a few of the programs. Was that necessary to fund the other priorities like air defense and munitions?
So you're absolutely right. There was a balance, and a balance that was meant to satisfy in priority order those top 10 priorities. So our aviation portfolio is one of the biggest of our entire modernization program. I think it accounts for about 25%. So yes, when we were balancing between all of these, the complexity of all these different priorities, so there were certainly a couple of things there that we chose to fund as opposed to more aviation capabilities.
The priorities in general, I know that the leadership always says that the size of the force is not as important as how trained and how well trained and equipped they are. So at what point do you have to stop growing the size of the Army to be able to get the resources to train and equip the forces?
So I would tell you, you should ask that question probably after we complete the strategic readiness review that's ongoing. I believe we'll have some better information on what the true size of the force needs to be once we complete that, and I understand that'll be probably later in the summer when we actually have that. Yes, sir. I'll get everybody, I promise. Yes, sir.
Scott Moss, Ewing Federal News Radio. Where does the readiness money at this point get you to fulfill your needs? You know, I mean, obviously this readiness is not as this been a motif through this, it's not a one-year thing. So where does this get you to? Could more money get you somewhere else, or is this what you can just do in a year?
So more money could do better for us. However, I would tell you it's not just money, it's time. So it takes a lot of time because readiness is very much an accumulative dynamic, right? A cumulative dynamic. What we more need than anything else is to have the consistent funding from year to year at a level that is consistent with the readiness we're trying to achieve. So right now, if we continue to perpetuate this funding level over a continuum of time, then we'll be able to achieve the level of readiness that we're trying to get to by 2021-22 timeframe. Sir.
Yes, Dan Parsons with Defense Daily. If your goal is to increase the armor capabilities of your brigades for a peer-on-peer fight, why the reduction in Abrams mods from 60 to 20? Is that because of availability of platforms, or is that a true reduction?
So I'll have to get back to you. But I'll have to get back to you on that specific answer. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask you what the total dollar amount might be for funding the 2 security force assistance brigades that are mentioned. And I saw a line item that mentioned $848 million for combatant command support, and so I wondered if that might be it, or where to find
So that's not it. So these 2 SFABs are listed a little over 1,000 people. So basically, when you talk about an SFAB brigade or 2 of them, you're basically just talking about the pay and entitlements and of the individuals. There's not a sizable amount of equipping or anything that associated with building those SFABs right now.
Do you have the total dollar amount?
Yeah, I do. I had it with me earlier today. I'll get it for you at the end of this briefing.
Is there a plan in the POM potentially to create more of these brigades, or do you know yet?
So we've had a lot of dialogue about that. I will tell you that I think, once again, we need to wait until the Department of Defense finishes its strategic readiness review before we can talk about anything beyond what's actually in the FY2018 budget request right now.
And just a quick point of clarification, you had said that the Iraq Train and Equip Fund was zeroed out and it basically moved to the Counter ISIS Train and Equip Fund?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I just
Yeah, both that and the Syria Train and Equip Fund.
So that's now lumped as one?
That's all lumped into one. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, James Drew from Aviation
Hi,
Week.
sir.
The Lakota, it tracks about I think $100 million or so in the procurement budget. Are you able to say how many aircraft that buys and maybe what the Army's strategy is going forward for that light utility helicopter program?
I can get you the exact number. The number 19 comes to mind, but I'm not. Don't take that as a bona fide certainty right now until I get.
That's over and above the original requirement that the Army originally had. So you're continuing to buy Lakotas going forward.
Yeah, I think there is a move afoot here to buy more than we had initially projected to acquire. Courtney, you had a question?
I'm just wondering what the rationale is for placing so much of the vehicle funding in the OCO account. I noticed particularly Bradley, basically all the Bradley mod funding is there, along with a substantial share of the Abrams upgrades and so on.
So because our primary focus is for the Brads and the Abrams. They're in Europe and building out the two APS, the ABCT. So putting it there was probably the right place to put it because it's going to initially be applied to those fleets.
Is that
So those will be applied to APS in Europe, for Europe, as opposed to going into units that are rotated in, or?
So I think it, initially, yes, it'll go towards the ABCTs there in Europe. I'll get you, probably need to look a little deeper into that before, to give you a more complete answer, but right now I know that's where the priority is.
So this will be your last question.
Okay, yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit about what was the bill, what's the Army, from the 18 budget to grow? The Congress directed you grow by 50,000, I guess, 26 in the active. What's the bill this year, and what's the bill in the FIDB? Dollar for dollar, I mean, how much more does the Army have to get to sustain the growth in this year?
So to grow the Army from, as you're well aware, we were in a pretty, well, we were going down to 450, we're at 476, and so right now, be fully burdened cost, we project it to be about $2.8 billion for the entire 26,000 that you're referring to. That includes the training money, the installation support, and that was what we costed that out to be.
That's in 18, and is that going to be annually then through?
So obviously we'll have to have an increased, or a funding level commensurate with that growth in the continued years. So I don't see it go, it won't grow more, but it'll certainly, to sustain that level, we have to have that increased amount of money.
Because that's the bill going forward that you're going to have to keep, you're going to have to pay for in the budget, in future year budgets, that roughly $2.8 billion.
Yeah, yes.
That's a lot, okay. On the AMPV, is the plan still to accelerate about 65 of those to Europe as part of the European insurance?
There is an acceleration component in this request for 18. I don't know if it's exactly 65, but I think you got the number right.
Can you say from 2020 to 19, or what the acceleration is? Or?
So let me double check. I think it was a 1 year acceleration increment, but let me double check on that for you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. If you have follow-up questions, please see Mr. Wayne Hall, and he will work those for you to get back to General Horlander. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.